not obvious why this case would be limited to TikTok or limited to China. Once you accept the idea that the government can protect us from foreign manipulation by preventing us from accessing foreign media, there are lots of other platforms the government might become concerned about.
Do national security interests outweigh your constitutional right to free speech? My name is James Lee, and you're watching Beyond the Headlines on Breaking Points. In April of 2024, Congress passed a law that would ban TikTok if their Chinese parent company ByteDance refused to sell the app to an American buyer. And just a few weeks ago, a federal court of appeals upheld that law. The government claims that it's protecting Americans from foreign manipulation and data theft. But critics warn the decision weakens the First Amendment and sets a dangerous precedent for free expression. So to help us understand what's at stake, I'm joined today by Jamil Jaffer. He is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Jamil, thank you so much for joining us today on Breaking Points.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. I guess just to catch people up, can you summarize for us what the recent ruling was from the DC Circuit Court? Specifically, why did the judges decide that banning TikTok does not violate the First Amendment of the Constitution? A term that I've heard being used is something called strict scrutiny. Wow, that's tough to say. Strict
Yeah.
scrutiny. So can you break that down for us in layman's terms so we can all understand what is going on here?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing you have to recognize is that, this is sometimes characterized as a ban on a foreign company operating in the United States, and that is not actually an accurate characterization of what's going on here. The effect of the ban is to prevent 170 million or so Americans from accessing a media platform that they would like to access. So it's a restriction on the rights of U.S. citizens and U.S. residents who want to, consume particular expressive products, but also participate in the conversation that takes place on TikTok. Share their own videos, watch other people's videos, engage with the various communities that have been built on that, on that platform. The DC Circuit understood that the law restricts Americans' First Amendment rights, and so started with basically the premise that this law is subject to scrutiny under the First Amendment. Now, in some ways that's unremarkable, but worth noting that the Biden administration did argue that the law shouldn't even be subject to First Amendment scrutiny, that basically the First Amendment was not implicated here at all, which is kind of a crazy argument. But the court rejected that argument. Then the question became, well, what kind of scrutiny? Like how closely should the court examine the government's motivations here and examine the law itself? And that's the debate that you referenced, this debate about strict scrutiny versus intermediate scrutiny. There were two judges on the court who believed that strict scrutiny was the right standard. Another judge thought that intermediate scrutiny was the right standard. But ultimately, all the judges concluded that the ban satisfies First Amendment requirements. So this dispute over the level of scrutiny didn't turn out to be um, consequential. The ban was upheld by all three judges. Basically, the argument, so there were really two arguments for the ban. One has to do with data collection. The theory is that TikTok collects a lot of data about its users. It obviously does collect a lot of data about its users, just like other social media platforms do. And so one justification for the ban is, well, this is a way of limiting data collection by TikTok. The other justification that the government offered was that TikTok is controlled by a Chinese corporation. That Chinese corporation, ByteDance, is under the influence of the Chinese government. And at one point or another, the Chinese government might decide, well, we want to use ByteDance and TikTok as a means of propagandizing or manipulating Americans. And there's a kind of degree of speculation here. I mean, some people would say a large degree of speculation. Even the government conceded there's no evidence. They have no evidence that TikTok is actually being used in this way. But this was the fear that motivated, or at least the government said in court, this is the fear that motivated the ban.
Yeah, I know that you co-wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently where you talked about this a little bit. You argued that the court gave, quote, near categorical deference to the government's national security claims. Like you said, we haven't been shown evidence of these claims. The DOJ did release that report, I believe, a couple months ago. Almost the whole thing was redacted, so we didn't really actually see any of the evidence that they were talking about. So is that normal, or can the government just use national security if they want to pass laws that basically push up against what's permitted by the Constitution?
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, there is a long history in this country of the courts deferring to the government in national security cases. Um, Now, there is a kind of counter history, or at least a thread of case law that is inconsistent with that sort of larger body of national security case law, and that thread of case law involves the First Amendment. So while it's true that courts generally defer to the government in national security cases, they have tended to be less deferential in First Amendment cases because the courts understand that free speech is so important to our democracy, and the integrity of public discourse is part of what gives legitimacy to the government's national security policies. In other words, the only reason we have faith, to the extent we do have faith, that the government's national security policies have democratic legitimacy is because we believe people can debate those policies openly and that the debate is informed. And so when the government invokes national security as a means of constraining that debate, the courts have been less deferential. So in this particular case, the judges were very deferential to the government. They basically accepted at face value that the government was motivated by those two concerns I mentioned, data collection and foreign manipulation, even though the legislative record makes it very, very clear that many legislators were motivated by disagreement with particular categories of content. There were lots of legislators who said this quite candidly. They said, look, I don't like the videos I see on TikTok. Like, they are encouraging our kids to do terrible things. They are calling into question our government's policies. They are pro-Russia. They are pro-Palestine, or pro-Hamas is the way that they put it. And the actual justification for the law, which legislators were quite open about, was let's suppress stuff that we disagree with. And the court dismissed all of that in one phrase. The court said, oh, it's true, there were some stray comments in the legislative record. It wasn't stray comments. The whole legislative record is replete with those kinds of comments. So that's one sense in which the court was, extremely deferential to, the government's factual assertions here, even though the evidence was inconsistent with those assertions. Another sense is when it came to, so both under strict scrutiny and intermediate scrutiny, the court has to look to what other ways the government would have had to achieve its stated goals. And here, there are lots of obvious ways the government could achieve its stated goals without banning Americans from accessing this app. So, for example, when it comes to foreign manipulation, the government says that the concern is that Americans are being covertly manipulated. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party is or may at one point manipulate them covertly by fixing the algorithm or screwing with the algorithm so that Americans see only what the Chinese government wants them to see. Now, again, it's highly speculative, but if that is the concern, it's not obvious why transparency doesn't address it. Like, why can't the government just tell Americans, we think this is propaganda?
Yeah, if we were to
You can
steelman
also,
that argument a little bit in terms of the TikTok ban, even if the government hasn't provided this concrete evidence for us, and we say, okay, let's go with a more precautionary approach to this, and let's say TikTok is controlled by China. They're using it exactly how we say they're using it for manipulating us to collect our data, this and that. and there are other apps that us Americans can use to voice our opinion. Just do that. How do you
Yeah.
respond to that kind of argument?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fine argument for the government to make to Americans. Like, if the government wants to say to Americans, use those other apps rather than this one, there's no reason the government can't do that. Um, but I think that, sort of core to the First Amendment, like at the very center of the First Amendment, is this idea that individuals get to decide for themselves which ideas are worth listening to, which media to consume. I mean, this is the center of the First Amendment. And the government can participate in public discourse about the platforms or about media. The government can say, don't watch MSNBC. It's propaganda. The government can say, don't watch Fox News. It's propaganda. That's, fine. But what it can't do is say, we're going to shut down MSNBC because we think you're being manipulated. I mean, this is just First Amendment 101, and I think the government's arguments are inconsistent with it. But I just wanted to say something about the data collection argument too, because here, the court was also extremely deferential to the Justice Department. The Justice Department was saying, well, this is about preventing TikTok from collecting data, but every other social media platform is collecting the same data or even more data about Americans, and this law doesn't do anything about those other actors. And to the extent the concern is, well, those other actors aren't controlled by China, and they're not, effectively puppets for the Chinese Communist Party. Well, the government itself, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, has observed in formal reports that China doesn't need TikTok in order to collect this kind of information on Americans. You can buy this kind of information on the open market. You can buy it from data brokers. And we've seen very recently that China can also collect information, much more sensitive information, just by hacking into American databases. And so it's not clear that this law really makes even a dent in the ability of the Chinese Communist Party to collect information about Americans. The much more direct way of restricting data collection is by restricting what data corporations can collect.
Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, yeah, how much interest Congress has in doing that, in particular, given some of the lobbying around, big
Yeah,
tech and things like that. But let's say, okay, so let's try to chart a path forward here. At this point, I know Trump has talked, verbally about doing something. He said he's going to take a look at it. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I guess one avenue that is clear going forward is that if this case does get picked up by the Supreme Court, how do you think the justices are likely to rule, given on historical precedent, some of the past cases, and given some of the comments that you
yeah,
just you referenced before about members of Congress explicitly stating that we're banning
yeah.
this app because of the content on it we don't like. So how damaging are those statements to the government's
Yeah.
case?
I mean, I guess I'm not ready to make predictions, but I accept that I will say that I think that TikTok will get a more sympathetic hearing in the Supreme Court than it did in the DC Circuit. I mean, there is case law in the Supreme Court. There's a 1964 case called Lamont versus Postmaster General, which involved a law that restricted Americans from um, uh, receiving foreign propaganda in the mail. It basically required them to register with the post office if they wanted to receive communist propaganda from abroad. And the Supreme Court struck down that law in 1964. It was actually the first time the Supreme Court struck down a federal statute under the First Amendment. Struck down that law because the court said it imposed a burden on Americans' right to receive information from abroad. And that was a case in which there was no dispute that what Americans were receiving from abroad was foreign propaganda. And even then, and even though it wasn't a ban, it was just a burden. The court struck that statute down. So I think that's a really strong precedent for TikTok here and for TikTok's users. And if the court departs from it, it'll be a pretty big deal. I guess I'll just say one more thing, like just getting away from doctrine, even apart from doctrine, these kinds of bans, like there's no precedent for the US government banning Americans from accessing a media organization like this. There's no precedent. Like there are cases in which the government tries to ban people from accessing certain information And the Pentagon Papers case was like one of those cases where the government tried to get the court to restrict the New York Times and the Washington Post from publishing this classified history of the Vietnam War or stories about this classified history. And even then, the court struck it down, right? But here we're going a step further and saying it's essentially the government saying, well, don't just prevent the Times from publishing that story, shut down the Times because they might publish that story. Um, these kinds of bans, I think, for good reason, have historically been associated with autocratic and rights abusing regimes. Like that's when we think of these kinds of bans on foreign media, those are the regimes that come to mind. And I think that the Supreme Court is going to be very wary of going down this road because we don't want to be in that company. And the First Amendment is supposed to keep us out of that company.
Yeah, well, we'll see what happens there. Oftentimes, there's no precedent until there is a precedent,
So there is,
if you know
it's
what I
true.
mean.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
the last question I want to ask is around this more broader context of we're kind of living in an age of information warfare, right? Because it used to be that publishing used to be controlled by just a few people, a few institutions, and now it's much more democratized. So it's hard for me not to think of a slippery slope where today maybe they get rid of TikTok and those users, let's say they migrate to other platforms. Let's say one of them is X. Now, let's say they start saying stuff on there they don't like, and X I know has significant foreign ownership, in this case Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia. So let's say one day they decide, okay, well, we don't like Saudi Arabia anymore. That's a foreign adversary. We're
Yeah.
going to get rid of X. So, reading the tea leaves a little bit, what do you see as the future of the First Amendment in the United States? The attacks on it, and what kind of effect does that have on democracy overall?
Well, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right that not obvious why this case would be limited to TikTok or limited to China. Like once you accept the idea that the government can protect us from foreign manipulation by preventing us from accessing foreign media, there are lots of other platforms the government might become concerned about, and as you mentioned, like Musk has business interests all over the world. I mean, that's true of Zuckerberg too. Like any of these, the people who own Bezos has business interests all over the world. And if your concern is, well, uh, domestic, Americans might be consuming media that has been influenced by foreign pressure, why stop at TikTok? Why not give the government the ability to restrict our access to the Washington Post or to X or I really do think that once you open this door, not obvious how you close it again. And then your broader question, I mean, you're right. For a variety of reasons, including the rise of sort of autocracy around the world, but also technological change and these new communications platforms that have emerged over the last 20 years. We're really in a totally new world, and you can't take for granted that the First Amendment precedents that the courts, set in the 1960s and 70s will be adhered to today. And, to be fair, you can't take for granted that those precedents are the right ones for this new world we're living in today. And I suppose that, in some ways is kind of exciting because we're kind of building, we have to build this kind of new system to account for all of these changes. But um, it does feel like some of the freedoms that we've taken for granted are suddenly, fragile and these cases like the TikTok case will have a huge effect on what the free speech landscape looks like in 5, 10 years.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that all plays out. Thank you so much today for your insights, Jamil. Is there anywhere you want to point the audience to if they want to learn more?
Yeah, the Knight Institute. So knightcolumbia.org.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much again for coming on the show, and we'll see how all this plays out.
Thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.